The easiest person to ignore is usually the one who notices everything. My name is Emma Carter, and for 2 years I cleaned the grandest mansion I had ever seen without anyone asking what I thought about anything that happened inside it. Every morning before sunrise, I unlocked the side entrance with the same brass key, tied my plain gray apron over a simple navy uniform, and stepped onto polished marble floors that reflected chandeliers worth more than every paycheck I had ever earned combined. The mansion overlooked the Hudson River, where the first light of day painted the water with soft gold, but I rarely stopped to admire the view because dusk never waited for beautiful mornings. The estate belonged to Vincent Calloway, a man whose name carried enough influence to make business leaders arrive early and leave carefully. I hardly ever saw him. When I did, he walked through the halls with quiet confidence, surrounded by attorneys, financial advisors, engineers, architects, and experts whose tailored suits seemed as perfectly organized as the schedules they carried. My job was invisible by design. I polished glass before meetings began. I replaced fresh flowers after guests left. I made certain every room looked untouched by ordinary life. That morning felt different the moment I heard unfamiliar voices echoing through the central hall. More than a dozen specialists stood around the mansion's advanced climate control system, studying digital screens, reviewing blueprints, and speaking over one another with increasing frustration. The house had developed a strange problem overnight. Entire sections refused to maintain the correct temperature, and expensive equipment continued reporting conflicting information. Every solution seemed to create another problem somewhere else. Technicians carried sophisticated instruments through the corridors while assistants hurried between rooms with tablets full of data. I quietly swept the marble staircase, pretending not to listen, but years of working in silence had taught me that people often revealed the truth when they believed nobody important was nearby. One engineer blamed outdated software. Another insisted a hidden sensor had failed. A consultant recommended replacing half the system before lunch. No one agreed with anyone else. Vincent stood near the enormous windows overlooking the gardens, listening patiently without interrupting, his calm expression revealing almost nothing despite the growing tension surrounding him. I carried my cleaning cart toward the library, passing the group without lifting my eyes, yet one detail refused to leave my mind. It was not something on a screen or inside a report. It was something I had noticed every morning for nearly a week while opening the windows in the East Wing. I kept walking because no one had asked for my opinion. Still, as another expert confidently declared that the answer would require days of investigation, I found myself wondering whether the smallest observation in the room had already been overlooked simply because it belonged to the maid. For the next 20 minutes, the discussion only grew louder. Blueprints covered the conference table, digital displays flashed rows of technical information, and every expert defended a different explanation with complete confidence. I quietly dusted the bookshelves lining the library, moving slowly enough to finish my work without interrupting anyone. The scent of fresh cedar polish mixed with the rich aroma of coffee drifting from the kitchen while sunlight poured through the tall east-facing windows, warming one side of the room more than the other. That tiny detail stayed in the back of my mind because I had noticed it every morning during my cleaning routine. One consultant confidently declared that several expensive components needed immediate replacement. Another recommended shutting down the entire climate system before permanent damage occurred. Assistants hurried in and out carrying folders and tablets, recording every suggestion as though the answer would eventually appear through repetition alone. Vincent Calloway remained remarkably calm. He listened without raising his voice, occasionally asking a short question that forced everyone back to the beginning of the same argument. I could tell he valued clear thinking more than impressive speeches, yet even his patience seemed to be wearing thin. As I emptied a small wastebasket beside the window, I noticed the heavy velvet curtain brushing against a narrow wall vent every time the morning breeze slipped through the slightly opened window. The movement was subtle enough that most people would never pay attention to it, especially while studying computer models instead of the room itself. I looked toward the thermostat mounted nearby. Every few seconds the curtain drifted directly across it before floating away again. My father had spent 30 years repairing heating and cooling systems in schools, churches, and old apartment buildings. He always told me that machines rarely lied. People simply forgot to look at the space around them. I hesitated. Nobody had asked for my opinion, and interrupting a room full of professionals was probably the fastest way to embarrass myself. I quietly returned my cleaning supplies to the cart and started toward the hallway, hoping someone else might notice the same thing. Before I reached the door, Vincent spoke without looking away from the group. "Does anyone have an observation we have not already heard?" The room fell silent. For reasons I still cannot explain, my hand slowly lifted. Several experts turned toward me with puzzled expressions. One of them offered a polite smile that carried more disbelief than encouragement. I swallowed my nervousness, looked at the curtain gently moving across the thermostat once again, and softly asked, "May I ask one simple question before anyone orders new equipment?" The question lingered in the air longer than I expected. A few people exchanged polite smiles while others looked back at their notes as though pretending not to hear me would make the moment disappear. One consultant folded his arms and said kindly, "Go ahead." His tone carried the quiet confidence of someone expecting an answer that could be dismissed within seconds. I took one careful breath before pointing toward the tall window. "Has anyone tried closing that window for just a minute?" Several heads turned in the same direction. Another engineer frowned. "The window has nothing to do with the climate control system." I nodded. Respectfully. "Maybe not. But the curtain does." Vincent followed my eyes toward the heavy velvet fabric drifting gently across the thermostat every time the breeze entered the room. Without saying a word, he walked to the window himself and quietly closed it before pulling the curtain several inches away from the wall. The room became perfectly still. We all watched the thermostat display. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. The temperature reading stopped fluctuating. A technician looked down at the monitoring tablet in his hands. "The east wing is stabilizing," he said, almost whispering. Another assistant checked a second display. "The other zones are already returning to normal." Nobody spoke after that. The silence felt almost louder than the arguments had been. One engineer slowly approached the thermostat, studying it as though seeing it for the first time. The curtain was trapping warmer air around the sensor, he murmured. The system kept compensating for a temperature that did not actually exist. Another expert quietly rubbed the back of his neck before letting out a small laugh at himself. We were diagnosing the equipment instead of observing the room. I lowered my eyes, suddenly wishing I had remained invisible again. My father used to remind me that simple answers often embarrassed complicated thinking. Vincent turned toward me with an expression I could not immediately understand. There was no surprise in his face anymore. There was only careful respect. "How long have you known?" he asked. I hesitated before answering honestly. "I noticed the curtain brushing the thermostat while cleaning every morning this week." I was not certain until everyone described the same symptoms today. He looked around the room before speaking to the experts in a calm voice. It took less than 1 minute to solve because someone paid attention long before today. No one argued with him. As I quietly reached for my cleaning cart, hoping to finish polishing the hallway before lunch, I realized every person in that room was watching me differently. For the first time since I had started working in the mansion, they no longer saw only the maid. They saw the person who had noticed what everyone else had overlooked. The mansion felt strangely quieter after the experts left that afternoon. The maintenance team returned to their schedules, assistants collected abandoned reports from the conference table, and sunlight continued spilling across the polished marble floors as though nothing unusual had happened. I pushed my cleaning cart through the west hallway, grateful that everyone seemed busy enough to forget I had spoken at all. That was how I preferred life. Recognition faded. Work remained. I polished the brass railings leading toward the second floor, replaced fresh flowers in the music room, and carefully dusted framed photographs that had overlooked those halls for decades. My routine had always been predictable, and I wanted it to stay that way. Just before lunch, the head housekeeper approached me with an expression I had never seen before. "Mr. Calloway would like to speak with you in the library," she said softly. My stomach tightened. I searched my memory for something I might have done wrong, but nothing came to mind. I straightened my apron, took one slow breath, and walked toward the same room where everyone had been arguing only an hour earlier. The library was now silent except for the gentle ticking of an antique grandfather clock. Vincent Calloway stood beside the tall windows overlooking the gardens, a single notebook resting on the table beside him. He looked up as I entered but did not immediately speak. Instead, he gestured toward a chair across from him. "Please sit down, Emma." Hearing my first name surprised me more than the invitation itself. I carefully sat at the edge of the chair, uncertain why the owner of the mansion wanted a private conversation with the maid. Vincent folded his hands calmly. "I have reviewed every report prepared this morning," he said. Not one of them mentioned the curtain. I offered a small smile. Reports usually describe machines. I was looking at the room. He nodded slowly, almost as though confirming something for himself. "That is exactly what interests me." His voice remained calm, free from flattery or exaggerated praise. "You noticed a pattern because you have been paying attention every day, not because someone assigned you the problem." I lowered my eyes for a moment before answering. "Cleaning teaches you to notice small changes. If you miss them, they become bigger tomorrow." A quiet smile appeared on his face. "Most people spend years collecting knowledge." He paused briefly before adding, "You collected observation instead." I did not know how to respond to that. My father had always believed ordinary work deserved extraordinary care, but I had never imagined someone like Vincent would understand that lesson. As I stood to return to my duties, he asked one final question that followed me through the rest of the day. "Emma, who taught you to see what everyone else overlooks?" His question stayed with me long after I left the library. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the marble hallway as I pushed my cleaning cart from one room to the next, but my thoughts remained in that quiet conversation. No one had ever asked where I learned to notice the little things. Most people only cared whether the work was finished. That evening, after my shift ended, I drove 20 minutes to the small white house where my father had spent almost his entire life. My mother still lived there, and although the porch paint had faded over the years, the wind chime above the front door sounded exactly the same as it had when I was a child. While preparing dinner together, she smiled when I told her someone had asked about Dad. "He would have liked that," she said softly. After dinner, I opened the old wooden toolbox that had remained untouched since he passed away. Every wrench, screwdriver, measuring tape, and flashlight rested in the exact place he had always kept them. Taped inside the lid was a handwritten note I had read hundreds of times. "Never repair what you have not observed." Those 7 words had shaped my entire life more than any classroom ever could. My father never attended college. He repaired heating systems in schools, churches, libraries, and neighborhood apartments for more than 3 decades. Whenever a customer described a problem, he listened carefully, but before touching a single tool, he always walked through every room in complete silence. As a little girl, I followed him carrying a small flashlight almost bigger than my arm. I once asked why he never hurried. He smiled and answered, "Machines leave clues. People just rush past them." That lesson stayed with me even after life changed. When Dad became sick, college was no longer possible. Bills came first. I found work wherever I could, eventually becoming a maid because steady pay mattered more than personal pride. Yet every hallway I cleaned became another classroom. Every window, every door hinge, every loose floorboard quietly taught me something about paying attention. The next morning, I arrived at the mansion before sunrise as usual. Nothing looked different until I reached the staff entrance. Waiting beside my cleaning cart was a brand new notebook with a simple leather cover. There was no ribbon, no expensive packaging, and no signature. Inside the first page, only one sentence had been written in neat handwriting. "The world always rewards those who notice what others ignore." I smiled without needing to ask who had left it there. For the first time since I began working in that mansion, I felt that someone had seen beyond the uniform and recognized the lessons hidden beneath years of ordinary work. The notebook became part of my morning routine. Before picking up a dust cloth or opening a single window, I wrote down one observation about the mansion that most people would probably overlook. Some mornings it was the way sunlight reached the east hallway 15 minutes earlier after the seasons changed. Other days it was the sound of a loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen or the faint scent of fresh cedar drifting from the library after the fireplace had been cleaned. I never expected anyone to read those notes. They simply reminded me that paying attention was a habit, not a talent. About 2 weeks after the climate system incident, I arrived to find unusual activity near the mansion's indoor conservatory. Landscapers, contractors, and designers stood around a large collection of imported plants that had begun losing their healthy color despite receiving constant professional care. Several specialists discussed soil chemistry, irrigation schedules, and specialized lighting while comparing reports filled with measurements. I quietly carried fresh linens through the hallway, listening without appearing interested. The conversation sounded familiar. Everyone searched for complicated explanations before studying the room itself. As I polished the glass doors leading into the conservatory, Vincent entered carrying his usual calm expression. He greeted each consultant respectfully, listened to every recommendation, then slowly looked around the room instead of immediately reading another report. I noticed something different about him. He was observing before speaking. His eyes paused on the windows, the ceiling, the watering equipment, and finally the plants themselves. It reminded me of my father walking silently through an old building before opening his toolbox. Vincent glanced toward me for only a moment, then returned his attention to the room. "Before we make any changes," he said evenly, "let us spend 1 minute observing instead of explaining." The specialists fell quiet. Nobody objected. That single sentence surprised me more than anything else that morning. He had not repeated my father's words exactly, but the lesson behind them was unmistakable. As everyone looked around in silence, I noticed the conservatory shades had been lowered during a recent furniture installation, blocking much of the natural morning sunlight that the plants normally received. I did not interrupt. This time I did not need to. After less than a minute, Vincent walked to the control panel beside the window and raised the shades himself. Bright sunlight poured into the room, illuminating every leaf with warm golden light. He smiled faintly before turning back to the consultants. Perhaps the simplest question should always come first. Then he looked at me with quiet appreciation. Without speaking another word, I understood that the greatest change inside the mansion was no longer happening to its rooms. It was happening to the man who owned them. The weeks that followed changed the atmosphere inside the mansion in ways no renovation ever could. Meetings became shorter because people spent more time observing before speaking. Employees who had once rushed to offer impressive answers now paused long enough to ask better questions. I continued cleaning the halls exactly as I always had, arriving before sunrise with my notebook tucked inside my apron pocket, never expecting my quiet routine to become part of someone else's. One crisp October morning, the executive chef hurried through the kitchen carrying visible concern across his face. A charity dinner for nearly 100 guests was scheduled that evening, yet the estate's historic dining room suddenly echoed with an irritating vibration every time the antique ventilation system started. Electricians inspected the motors. Restoration specialists examined the century-old woodwork. Everyone offered a different explanation, and every recommendation seemed expensive. I quietly polished the silver serving trays while listening to the conversation drift through the open doorway. The sound itself caught my attention long before the words did. The vibration appeared only when the ventilation reached a specific speed, then disappeared just as quickly. It reminded me of something my father once showed me inside an old church where a loose decorative panel amplified a harmless mechanical hum until everyone believed the furnace was failing. I kept working, determined not to interrupt. Before I could leave the room, Vincent entered with several advisors following behind him. Instead of asking for another report, he stood perfectly still and listened. The dining room fell silent except for the gentle vibration that returned a few moments later. He closed his eyes for several seconds, then opened them and looked directly toward me. There was no command in his voice, only trust. "Emma," he said calmly, "what do you notice?" Every face turned toward me, but this time I did not feel nervous. I slowly walked along the wall until I reached a carved wooden display cabinet standing beneath an air vent. I rested 2 fingers lightly against one corner. The vibration became stronger beneath my hand than anywhere else in the room. I smiled gently. "I do not think the ventilation is the problem," I said. "I think the cabinet is acting like an echo." A maintenance supervisor carefully adjusted the cabinet away from the wall by less than an inch. The ventilation started again. The vibration disappeared completely. Several people quietly laughed with relief, not because anyone had been embarrassed, but because the answer had been so wonderfully simple. Vincent looked around the room before smiling at the team. "Today we solved the problem together," he said. Then he glanced at me with quiet gratitude, and I realized respect had become something shared instead of something earned alone. Autumn settled gently over the estate, and with it came changes that no architect could have designed. The mansion still looked exactly the same from the outside, with its limestone walls, iron gates, and perfectly trimmed gardens overlooking the Hudson River, yet the people inside carried themselves differently. Housekeepers greeted engineers by name. Managers paused before giving instructions. Even visiting consultants spent a few extra moments walking through a room before opening their laptops. I noticed those changes the same way I noticed everything else, not because anyone announced them, but because small habits always reveal larger truths. The biggest surprise was hearing my own name spoken throughout the mansion. For months I had simply been the maid. Now the chef waved when I entered the kitchen. The groundskeeper asked whether I had noticed anything unusual after the previous night's storm. The maintenance supervisor occasionally invited me to walk through a room before beginning a repair, not because I knew more than he did, but because another perspective had become something people valued instead of ignored. One afternoon Vincent called a brief staff gathering in the sunlit atrium where employees from every department stood together beneath towering glass ceilings filled with natural light. I assumed another renovation project was about to begin, so I quietly stood near the back beside the housekeeping team. Vincent thanked everyone for their work over the past several months before holding up a small leather notebook nearly identical to the one he had quietly left for me weeks earlier. He smiled with calm sincerity. "Starting today," he said, "every department will keep an observation journal. Before suggesting solutions, we will first record what we actually see." A few people exchanged curious smiles while others immediately nodded in understanding. My heart skipped when he continued. This idea did not come from a consultant or an executive meeting. It came from someone who reminded all of us that paying attention is often more valuable than speaking first. He never mentioned my name, and somehow that made the gesture even more meaningful. After the meeting ended, employees collected their notebooks with quiet enthusiasm before returning to work. As I walked back toward the east hallway carrying fresh linens, Vincent fell into step beside me. For several moments we listened to the peaceful sounds of the mansion instead of filling the silence with unnecessary conversation. Finally he said, "The house feels different now." I smiled while looking through the tall windows where golden leaves drifted across the gardens. "The house has always been the same," I answered softly. "The people simply learned to notice one another." He looked around the hallway before giving a thoughtful nod. Perhaps that was the problem we should have been solving from the beginning. In that moment I realized the greatest lesson had never been about thermostats, windows, or old furniture. It had always been about helping people discover the value that had quietly existed around them all along. Nearly a year has passed since the morning everyone gathered around a thermostat and forgot to look at a curtain. Sometimes I stand beside the same east window before sunrise, watching the Hudson River catch the first light, and I wonder how a single ordinary moment managed to change so many lives. The mansion remains beautiful, but beauty no longer comes only from polished marble or crystal chandeliers. It comes from the people who fill its rooms. Engineers now walk through every space before opening their laptops. Managers ask housekeepers what they have noticed. Gardeners share ideas with designers. Every voice carries value because everyone has finally learned that wisdom is not measured by job titles. One winter afternoon, I found Vincent standing alone in the library, writing inside one of the observation journals that had become part of the mansion's daily routine. Snow drifted quietly beyond the tall windows, covering the gardens with a peaceful blanket of white. He closed the notebook as I entered with fresh flowers for the reading table. "Do you know what surprises me the most?" he asked. I smiled gently. "Probably not." He looked around the silent room before answering. "I spent years believing the greatest investment was hiring the smartest experts I could find." He paused for a moment, then continued with the same calm honesty that had gradually become part of who he was. "The greatest investment was learning to listen to people I never expected to teach me anything." I placed the flowers into a crystal vase and quietly adjusted one branch that leaned slightly to the side. "My father always said every room tells a story," I replied. "Most people are simply too busy talking to hear it." Vincent laughed softly before looking out toward the snow-covered grounds. "Then your father taught me something too." Neither of us needed to say anything else. The silence between us felt complete because understanding no longer required explanation. As I walked back through the familiar hallway, employees greeted one another with easy smiles, notebooks rested on desks throughout the mansion, and ordinary conversations carried an unexpected sense of respect. I realized I had never truly repaired a climate system, solved a mansion's problems, or changed a powerful man's life by myself. All I had done was notice what everyone else had overlooked and speak when the moment finally mattered. Looking back now, people often ask how someone with no degree managed to succeed where so many professionals struggled. I always give them the same answer. Knowledge teaches people where to look. Humility teaches them what they are willing to see. And in the end, the smallest observation can become the greatest lesson when someone finally decides that every person in the room deserves to be heard.